Hello, everyone. So it's 2 o'clock. We'll get started. My name is Shirlene Willis, and I'm with Opal Group, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, which again is titled Achieving a Single Source of Truth with BI in Your Enterprise. So before we jump into things, I'd like to go over just a couple of items. Please submit your questions throughout today's session in the Q&A part of our webinar here. Feel free to submit those in real time as you hear from our presenters today, and we'll get to those at the Q&A portion at the end of our webinar. Also, this is going to be recorded and the slides are also going to be saved, and both will be made available to you after today's event. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce you. Marius and Mike will be joining us here. And Marius is the CEO of Metric Insights. Mike is the VP of Sales and Marketing with Metric Insights. Those will be your speakers for today, and I'll hand it over to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlene. And thanks everyone for joining. Today we're going to go through and talk about the single source of truth. And our agenda is to really talk about, why that's important. But then we're hoping to give you some very tangible things you can walk away from this webinar. So we're going to talk about some of the customer journeys that we've seen with our customers as they tackled the single source of truth and the number of challenges that they faced, how they overcame those challenges, and just give you, a few examples of some techniques and ideas that you can see from our product that hopefully you can use. And then we'll wrap up with Q&A for your questions. So to get started, so single source of truth, why does it matter? Well, I would argue that having a single source of truth, having data that your users fundamentally trust, it is the foundational element for your infrastructure. It's the foundation on top of which your entire business intelligence stack is built. After all, it really doesn't matter, if you have the best possible data pipelining, amazing visualization and reporting, you've got great algorithms that do all kinds of predictive analysis. If your users do not trust your data, then all that is for naught, because ultimately they will ignore the results from all that work, and you will not get benefits from it. So if you think about it, how do you know how much trust your users have in your data? Well, there are two things fundamentally that tell you where you are in that journey. One of them is looking at usage. So if you don't have a high level of trust, your usage and engagement with the analytics that have been created will be fairly low. So if you're looking at if you're tracking, how, that doesn't matter what BI tool is using, if you're just looking and saying, how often are people looking at these, what percentage of your population is actually engaging with them on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. If you've got low usage, you usually have some issues with data trust. And then the second key metric is you're seeing that your ROI is low. So that can be measured in a couple of different ways. You can look at maybe your BI tool spend and saying, I've got maybe 500, 1,000, 10,000 licenses for my BI tool, but only 50% or fewer of my users actually actively in that tool, using the tool for anything. Or another way to look at that is, maybe there's been looking at spend around, you've built a whole set of reporting, your team has worked on that for several sprints, a lot of investments gone into it, the data pipeline, the creation of the use case, and then, what is the usage of that, 6 months after it's been released? If it's not very high, if hardly anyone's engaged with it, you've got some serious ROI issues, and that means that data is not getting to users in a way that they can trust and engage with. Now, when you think about that single source of truth, we'd argue that you want to think of it not in a multidimensional way. Everyone thinks about the left side of the equation. They think about this consistent data. How do I get data quality in place? How do I make sure that it's accurate? How do I make sure that definitions are in place? But there's really another side of the equation. As that expression goes, it takes two to tango. And the other part of that dance is looking at how data is used, getting consistent usage of that information. So For example, it doesn't matter if you have the best possible sales data warehouse. You've taken great pains to make sure you've got good definitions, your data is clean, it's pristine, consistent. You're making sure every time it gets loaded every day, it's of a high quality. If you have now 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different reports that use different criteria for how you compute gross margin, it doesn't matter the data is consistent because reporting is inconsistent. And so when users are looking at their different dashboards, they're seeing different numbers, and thereby it appears that they cannot trust the data. It appears that there is not a single source of truth. So in all cases, you've got to think of these things together. What the nature of the data and the nature of the way the data is used, and make sure that there's harmony, that there's consistency in the way that those work together. Furthermore, when you think about getting to a single source of truth, it's not really a destination. Rather, it's more of a journey. The reason I say that is it's not like you can say, okay, let's spend the next 2 sprints, everybody just work on making everything consistent, and we'll be done and we'll have achieved it. It doesn't work that way. Even if if you're very high along the way, if you're very far along the way in your evolution, and you have great data, and you've got really very consistent reporting around that, invariably there are changes in the data. New data sources are being added all the time. New anomalies come up in the data all the time, and on the reporting side, there's always new content being built out. So really, to be effective, you've got to think about this, getting to a single source of truth as a journey that you're taking your organization on. And you want to consider, as you go on this journey, what are the things that are going to make that journey more difficult, and what's going to make it easier. And hopefully, as we go through this webinar, we can highlight a few things that you can think about that will make the journey more enjoyable, so that you're taking your users with you as you improve the data quality in your enterprise, rather than having them complaining and screaming at you when there's issues that come up. So to do that, we're going to talk about 4 different use cases. We're going to talk about, these are real companies, and we're going to talk about a scenario. For example, one is a large retail company where they were facing dashboard overload, and that was causing some significant problems around getting to a single source of truth. We're going to talk about a software company that had data engagement challenges, lots of analytics out there, not a lot of usage, and what they did about that. We're going to examine a pharmaceutical company that had some severe data quality issues. They were impacting morale and the relationship between their BI team and their sales team. And finally, we're going to look at a clinical trials company and look at how they were managing the changing operational environment that they faced with the COVID-19 crisis. So let's dive in. So the first use case is one where we have a Fortune 100 company versus very large retailer, 70,000 employees, tens of thousands of reports in their infrastructure across multiple BI tools. And when they looked at their infrastructure, they had 30 different BI portals, right? And this is everything from SharePoint sites to custom pages that were built, to things built via WordPress, you name it. There were, each organization, each unit was building their own portals to be able to collect the vast quantity of information that's available to the end users, try to organize and curate it and deliver it to the end business users. And this was causing a huge lack of consistency. So some business units were doing a great job in terms of documenting. They were identifying lineage, they were identifying, when changes were made, they were communicating it effectively, while others were not doing that. And as others were having duplicative reporting showing up, they were not doing change governance. And that inconsistency meant that their users were telling them that they could not really trust what they were looking at, because they were not sure, is this something that's been vetted and certified, or is this something that is maybe just been developed and nobody's really checked across all the other numbers. Furthermore, they were having a problem with discoverability. So, sometimes somebody would look for content, but they wouldn't find it because it wasn't something they were being granted access to. And that meant that they didn't know if that existed. They would ask for someone else to create it. And now all of a sudden there were 2 or 3 versions of the same thing that had been created. And so that was causing problems with the duplicative content, generating lack of trust that the right information was there. So what did they do, right? To solve this problem, they really standardized and pulled everything together into a centralized portal. Now, of course, in an organization with 10,000 users, you're not going to have any single entities, a single group run an entire portal with all that content. It's just vastly too much content. So they devised a mechanism by which they had a hub and spoke model, where there was a center of excellence, and the center of excellence built the standards for how portals should work. They stipulated things like this is the kind of tagging that you need to have, this kind of certification you need to have in place, what you need to document for change control and management. And then they distribute out responsibility to the BI teams that supported each business unit to populate the content for the catalog and to make sure that content was maintained so that it's fresh, so that it's relevant, so that it has the right documentation, and that it adheres to the centralized standards, and that everything is certified and discoverable. So I'm going to turn this over to Mike, and he's going to give you kind of an example of how this was done, so that you can kind of get a flavor of how this works in reality.
Yeah, thanks, Marius. So as Marius just said, I'm going to take you through sort of some examples of these use cases that we're going to cover today. And obviously on the Metric Insights platform here, but think about the approaches more than the technology that we're showing here. So this first concept of a sort of centralized portal that this company was working on, really the first part of that is being able to connect to every source of BI content in the organization. So Marius mentioned they had multiple platforms, multiple reporting platforms, multiple sources of content that was important to the business users. And so step one was making connections into those systems and then allowing these groups, Marius spoke about the hub and spoke model, allowing these groups across the organization to publish content into the portal. And so an example is sort of what you're looking at here, is where they ended up with sort of this global catalog or library of content in the organization. And as they published content, they were publishing these tiles to the library, where each tile is essentially representing a piece of content from a particular system that they had out in the organization. And so obviously that was content coming from existing BI tools that they were using. It was also content in the form of metrics and KPIs that they wanted to publish to users. And we'll look at this concept a bit later in the webinar. But really any source of information, as I mentioned, whether it's spreadsheets, documents, data coming from a database, the goal is to publish all this in one place and provide a consistent experience for users. And so once the catalog was starting to be populated, users can come in and access this content. And when they do that, they were getting a consistent experience. So as they click on pieces of content to access it, they're able to see details about the content, so who owns it, when it was last updated, images, preview images of what the content actually looks like as a visual clue of what they're going to access, that update every time the data updates in this particular dashboard. And if they drill into that, going into a live version of that dashboard without having to know that necessarily it exists in Tableau or Click or MicroStrategy, whatever the underlying platform is, they can then access that live dashboard embedded within the portal environment. And by embedding it in a portal like this, they could wrap then a set of consistent functionality around every dashboard, regardless of the underlying technology that it came from. And it's things like being able to bookmark content. So if I always look at a particular slice of data for a particular region, anytime I open a dashboard with region in, it would pre-filter that content. Documentation around the content. So as you publish content through the portal, being able to add definitions and help and release documentation about it, so users know what they're accessing. The ability to share content with other users if I see something unusual in the data. and also the ability to collaborate around this content in a consistent way, again, regardless of what tool it might exist on the back end. So by publishing it through the portal, sort of removing this ambiguity around the underlying technologies, users can then come and access this content as though they're in a single application effectively. Now, obviously, there's also a sort of security and permissions aspect to this as well. So I just opened another browser window here where I'm logged in as sort of more of an end user of the portal environment. And my permissions are ultimately going to dictate what I have access to in terms of, categories of content, in terms of tiles that I might be interested in, even in terms of, as I mentioned before, when I drill into a particular tile, the slice of data that I'm going to focus on that's relevant to me. So in this case, pre-filtered to my country. Within the portal as well, they have this concept of search. So similar to what you might see within a Google search, users can come in and search through the content that they have access to. It will recommend search terms as they enter values. It will analyze their search criteria and bring back a ranked list of results across all the data sources. So again, they can easily find content based on what they're interested in at that particular point in time. A couple of other things that happen within the portal that are sort of critical to driving trust with this content as well. The concept of certification. So the ability to give certain content a stamp of approval when it's been through a QA and test process. With all this content across the organization being published, some content might still be sort of in development or being tested. Others may be blessed and certified. And so as a user, I need to be able to easily see what has been certified, who certified it, when that happened. And then the final concept, and Marius touched on this, is that of discoverability as well. So permissions dictate what content I have access to, but certain groups are publishing content that they effectively want to make known to the whole organization. And even though I don't have permissions to see things, it may show up when I search or browse the catalog. And tying that to a workflow so that I can then request access to that if it's something that I'm interested in. So again, certain items may be made discoverable so users can see that at least they're available, and I might want to take note of that and look at it. So that's a quick example of how a sort of consolidated portal might be implemented.
Thanks, Mike. So basically the results, just to sort of summarize for them, was that, by putting everything together into a single portal, putting together a layer of governance around that, they were able to enforce a consistent set of governance. They were able to have accountability around certification. So Mike showed certification, but it's not just about knowing which content is certified. It's about users being able to know who certified that content, when was it certified, and that creates the necessary level of transparency such that they know, well, this is that person I hold accountable for this, and the person who certified it knows they're being held accountable for it. So that's very, very positive sort of dynamic that was developed out of that. And then the discoverability allowed the people to uncover things that were of interest to them, and know that if they searched and they couldn't find it, then in fact it wasn't that they just weren't given access to it, that just doesn't exist. And they know they could trust the quality of the search. So going into a second example, a second use case, this is a technology company, a large Fortune 400 company. And they had lots and lots of analytics, and they were using Power BI and Tableau, many, many reports. And when they looked at the usage stats, when they looked at within these reports, they found that they were not really getting a whole lot of engagement. And they did a study internally. They talked to their users. They did surveys. They tried to figure out why is that happening. And they found out that really at the end, their business users were telling them that the juice was not worth the squeeze. right? That it was taking too long to find the analytics that were interesting, that when they did find something, oftentimes that particular report that the dash would look at, they'd have to flip through a whole bunch of different filters to get to the relevant slice of data that's meaningful for them, for their business. And they're not, you know, at the end of the day, when they looked at that, it might not even be anything useful. It might not be telling them anything different today than it told them yesterday, right? And so, you know, with that information in mind, they start thinking, well, how can we really increase engagement? Given that, you know, we're learning that our users will only spend 1, maybe 2 minutes a day looking at analytics. That's all they're willing to put into this because they're just so busy. They've got so many other things going on. How do we really engage them in that very limited time and connect them to the single source of truth that's relevant to them? You know, the numbers that they need to know to take action on that particular day. So what they came up with was the thought, well, you know, instead of making their users come to the analytics, they said, you know, they turned the paradigm around. They said, no, we're going to push this content out to the users, and we're going to pre-filter and distribute to our user community the content that's relevant to them. That doesn't mean the same content to everyone. That means for each team, that those particular analytics that have contained trusted, verified content, pre-filtered for their particular slice of the data, delivered in such a way that they can quickly take action on the data. So Mike is going to show an example of that type of a solution.
Yeah, so as Marius said, oftentimes it's not enough to just make the content available. We want to push it out, and actually when they did that, they looked at it from 2 perspectives. So obviously from a sort of centrally administered perspective, distributing content to groups of users based on what they're interested in, but also enabling a self-service paradigm as well, so that, you know, there's the governed set of content that is going out on a regular basis, but also let users self-subscribe to content. And so, you know, what did that look like in their environment? Well, it was the ability to take elements out of the catalog that we were looking at before, and ultimately, you know, logically group them into folders that they then wanted to distribute. So by dragging tiles into folders, they could create sort of these use case collections of content, you know, whether it's the weekly executive distribution that's going to go out, or whether it's, you know, the set of content for our sales meetings to our sales teams every Monday morning. I can drag the content in that's relevant, the metrics, the dashboards. I can then include those in what we refer to in our platform as a burst, but think of it as an email distribution that's going to go out to those users. So a burst contains that folder of content that I've chosen. It goes out on a schedule to users. So it's triggered based on a schedule and checking that the underlying data has been updated before it sends it. And then on that schedule, we're going to send that out via an email, obviously customize the email in terms of subjects and content and the look and feel, but then subscribe our different groups of users and users to that particular burst. And the net result is that if I go across to my email here, is, you know, based on the content that I've dropped into that folder and the groups and users I've subscribed to it, they will start receiving emails on that particular schedule. I mentioned right at the beginning, we pick up images of the content each time it updates. And so the result of that is within the email, I'm seeing an accurate view of what the dashboard looks like at the time the email went out, again, regardless of source it may have come from. I'm also going to get pre-filtered to what I'm interested in. So if this was the weekly sales management email that goes out, and all these dashboards are filtered by region, when I receive it, I'm going to see my region. When Marius receives it, he's going to see his region. And that's one burst that they have to set up and administer within the environment. So that's sort of pushing content out to people. Obviously, these hyperlink back into the portal. Another way of looking at this is then allowing users to self-subscribe to content. So again, as a user of the platform, I can drag tiles into a personal favorites folder. So this is the content that right now I'm particularly interested in tracking. It obviously provides me a shortcut to that content, but it also, again, instructs the portal to start sending me a summary of my favorites folder on a particular schedule, say daily. And so out of everything I've put into my favorites folder, do things like tell me which metrics are changing the most, whether metrics have generated anomalies that might be interesting, or give me a view of any dashboards that have updated since I last received the email. So Marius mentioned that the initial challenge was engagement. People were overwhelmed. It wasn't worth the effort. So typically you don't want to receive everything all the time. This is just going to show me, what's changed since I last received the email. What was the dashboards that updated since yesterday. So once we're making this content available, once we're pushing it out to users, a critical piece of this as well is tracking usage of this content. So we know exactly what is being used and what is useful. And so it's also critical for people publishing content through the portal to understand what that usage is like. So they're also tracking all the views of every piece of content within the portal. And a view is anyone not just accessing the particular dashboard, but receiving it in their email or within their digest every day or whatever the frequency might be. And so with that, they're able to see, what's the most popular content, what's increasing in popularity, what's going out of favor, what's not getting used, and really get a feeling for what is the most active content that we have in there. And also, from an engagement with that content perspective as well. So this visualization is showing them, when they publish a piece of content like this Tableau sales analysis dashboard, over the period, the 30, 60, 90 days since I've published this, who is actually engaging with that content? How often are they looking at it? How are they making use of this dashboard that I'm pushing out there? So again, I can use this to get a better feeling for how useful it is to my users. All right, so we'll flip it back to you here.
So, right, so basically the results of this, to sort of summarize what this organization was able to achieve, was, by distributing the content out in the way that Mike described, pre-filtered content, it cut the amount of time that users had to look for things zero. They immediately knew that the information that they had was relevant, was the correct certified content, so they didn't have to be hunting around for it. And that increased the trust and increased the engagement, because they found that because it was delivered easily, because they could look every day and in the morning, opening their email, looking in a minute, they could understand what things had changed significantly, where they needed to pay their attention. They were able to generate a significantly higher engagement, and they were able to see that engagement by monitoring it, right? So kind of were able to close the loop, and that told them that in fact their efforts were successful, and or where they were not successful, they could figure out, well, is the content correct? Are they sending the right information? Is it a matter of educating the users? And kind of going through that process to really fine tune the interface between the content that gets pushed to users, what users are consuming, and making sure that the users trust the data and access it as a single source of truth. So another use case that's very interesting, and this is more to do with data quality, is a major pharmaceutical company. If there's any of you on this call that are working in the pharmaceutical industry, then you know that organizations that sell pharmaceuticals, they rely on third-party providers to understand what kind of a sell-through they're getting, how often are their physicians prescribing their products, and they have a team of sales reps that will call on physicians to educate them about the benefits of the pharmaceutical that the company makes, how it differentiates with the competitors, and so forth, to be able to drive adoption. So pharmaceutical companies rely on third-party data to be able to understand how well they're penetrating the market, and then they compensate their sales reps based on that information. Well, this particular pharma company was finding that their third-party data provider would periodically have issues with the data. Perhaps a particular pharmacy or a physician just underreported that they didn't get the data, right? The third party didn't get the data on time, it was published, and the sales rep saw a number that indicated market share that was actually below what it should have been had the data been accurate. But they wouldn't discover this for quite some time. They would find out about it because, maybe a month or 2 or 3 down the line, the data would get corrected, and then they would say to the rep, oh, sorry, this was a problem, and it's now been corrected. That was a terrible situation because, if you think about it, there's no more important data to a sales rep than the data that is being used to determine how much money they take home every week, right? So that was just creating a lot of morale issues within the sales organization, and it was creating just an overall distrust between the sales organization and the BI team. So what did they do? Well, they introduced a data quality analysis layer before the data actually made it out to the rep. So they collected the data from the third party, just like they would normally, but before it's actually pushed out to the reps and used for decision-making internally, they did analysis to be able to figure out, are there any anomalies in here? And where are those anomalies across all the different dimensionality of your data? And then based on that, then they could investigate the anomalies. The analyst could look at that anomaly first and identify, oh, this looks like it could be a data quality issue. Let me go talk to the data provider and see if in fact they might have had a collection issue. Or if in fact they found out there was not a data collection issue, then they could with confidence let the sales rep know that there is in fact something going on in their territory. Maybe they need to take some action, call on a particular physician more, or change their strategy. But they knew that the anomalies that were there were real, and then when the cases that were not real, they could tell them in advance. So Mike will show you an example of how that gets accomplished.
Yeah, let's take a look at sort of 2 perspectives on this. Across to my browser here. So we've shown initially sort of connecting to BI tools that have content that exists in the organization already. Here in this example, we're actually collecting data into the portal. And we're looking at sort of 2 types of anomaly, I guess. We're looking at anomalies as it relates to business metrics that you're tracking, as Marius said, volume of prescriptions for different drugs by different pharmacies in different territories, and then true data quality type issues, where we're looking for exceptions that indicate the number of rows that got loaded is unusual compared to last month, that sort of thing. So from a business metric perspective, they're essentially using these time series KPIs as sort of leading indicators that there may be either data quality issues or business issues that the rep needs to know about. And so an example here is simply that. So we're looking at the volume of prescriptions, in this case on a monthly basis, by the different pharmacies within our different territories that we're collecting data for. You can see that time series on the chart here, going back a couple of years in this case. And they're using our platform essentially to automate the process of looking for outliers within that time series. So what's happening is every time they receive a new file effectively from the third-party provider, and that's getting uploaded into the platform, we're automatically running analysis against that time series to look at a moving average against the data set. We're looking for statistical outliers for every pharmacy, for every drug, to see if there's any sort of highs or lows in the data that could be an indication that something went wrong in the data collection, or again, that could be an issue that we want to alert the rep to. And so you'll see here on this chart that there's certain alerts that have triggered over time. And we've seen a gradual increase in volume from this particular pharmacy, but suddenly this last month we've seen a drop off. And that's a statistically significant value in this time series. And so we're able to generate alerts on this particular anomaly where, in their case, they send an email to the sales ops team to go and look at this in more detail. So as these alerts get triggered, there's actually a workflow off the back of them where, again, it assigns it to someone to go and investigate it. They can look into the data, see whether they consider it a data issue, as Marius said, or whether it is truly something with that particular pharmacy. And if so, reassign it to the sales rep with a comment to say, something going on here, you might want to check it out. Data looks correct. So without having to set up a lot of different rules or alerts, using this automated process to look for outliers gives them a step ahead in terms of understanding what's happening within the data. They also set up some custom alert rules against these metrics. So they use the platform to go through if there's certain baselines that reps are being compensated against. They can upload those as sort of targets into the system. Again, it's another way of, the baselines are based on historical data. They can track the numbers coming in as against those baselines. They can set up alert rules that track against those baselines, simulate it. Again, set up alerts that go out to the users and, assign workflows, as we mentioned before, if appropriate, where it gets assigned to an individual with a particular action that they have to take. So that's using sort of the business metrics as a leading indicator of what's going on within the data that they're collecting. The other thing they do is look at it from more a sort of raw data perspective. So actually what's happening with a lot of companies like this is they receive these data files on a monthly basis showing the volume of drugs being prescribed. But that file typically has a rolling 2, 3, 4 months of data in it. So every month they're getting sort of repeated data. And what they're able to do in this case is sort of compare those data files on a month-by-month basis. As Marius said, oftentimes pharmacies report late, or there's they report, but then there's a reconciliation and a change in volume the previous month. But because I have this rolling monthly data happening, I can compare the snapshots very easily every month. And so I can start to, when I see those issues in the business volume, come back and say, okay, did anything change in this month's snapshot? For example, were there missing records that we actually happened to see last month, but suddenly they've disappeared? Or were there changes in volume because certain pharmacies were reporting late? Or did pharmacies get dropped because they haven't reported yet and missed the deadline when the file came over? So really going through a sort of change analysis of the data that's coming in is, typically the way that they're taking that business time series metric, saying, okay, it looks like something unusual happened. Let's drill into the snapshots and see what might have caused that. And if they don't see anything here, it's a good indication that something happened with that pharmacy, and it's over to the rep to go and sort it out.
So what were the results of this? Basically, they found that it's, by doing what we just discussed, they were able to change the posture of the BI team. They went from a reactive state where they were just responding to reps, telling them that they don't believe in the data and that there were issues, to one where they were proactive. They were doing the investigation before the data got to the reps. That increased the level of transparency and the level of trust in between within the organization, specifically, the reps and the BI tool relationship improved, and it just improved the overall quality of not only the data, but the effectiveness of the reps, because they knew they could trust the data. They knew that when they did get a report on something that looked anomalous, that looked bad, that it was something they needed to take action on. They weren't going to just ignore it and assume that it was going to be a data issue that got resolved, some months down the line. So our final use case that we wanted to examine is a clinical trials company. So this is a company that does a vast number of clinical trials globally for almost all of the pharmaceutical companies around the world. And they, all of us on this call, I think your business, I'm sure, was impacted by COVID in a significant way. None of us have gone unscathed, either positively or negatively. There was impact, but this impact was particularly pronounced for this organization, because if you think about how clinical trials are run, right? You have to go into doctors' offices, you have to meet with patients, you have to administer drugs, you have to meet and do follow-ups with them. You often have to do additional doses. When COVID hit, every single country was in a different state of lockdown. In some cases, you couldn't go into doctors' offices anymore. In other cases, there was some ability to do it under certain protocols. So the entire fundamental way in which they were doing their business and running their trials had to be rethought and redone to address the crisis and still move forward these important clinical trials that were taking place. And to do that, they needed to understand exactly what was going on in each country. They needed to have access to all the data. And that information for the executives was sort of strewn around all these different dashboards, different metrics in different places. So getting to that unified single source of cohesive truth was very, very challenging for them. A lot of time was spent looking across different dashboards. Which one do I trust? How do I organize it? And so they came up with basically an operational metrics framework, a way to kind of roll up and create a mashup of all of the key KPIs that each country manager, trial manager, overall executive needed to keep track of across all the different dimensions of their business in a single place. So truly a single source of truth. You don't have to go in 20 different places. It's all in one place. And then they use this as a launching point to find more details. So at a top level, they could see through simple stoplighting, how are they doing operationally across all the different KPIs that they're tracking. And then those KPIs that required attention, they could immediately drill down and find out more information. And so Mike is going to show you an example of how that gets accomplished.
Yeah, and I think the key point here is that what we're talking about here is being able to present data in a very meaningful way to end users. Again, even though that data is coming from multiple sources. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that. Obviously, the one Marius just spoke about, but really it's being able to take elements of that catalog that we've been talking about, mash it up into a single view for users, and allow them to easily consume that data. And if they have questions of it, drill into it for more detail. So here's an example of the one Marius was just talking about. These are metrics and KPIs that are coming from very different dashboards and data sources across the business. They're actually driven by those sort of time series analysis that we were looking at in the last use case. And in a snap, I can see what's doing well, what's underachieving. I can drill into content. So, if I want to go to a dashboard behind this particular metric, it's easy to drill into that. It will take me into the underlying tool and into the underlying dashboard that tool came from, in this case, Tableau. But again, the concept here is the ability to really take components of the catalog and make it readily available for users. So, if we go back to sort of the pharmaceutical use case a little bit, or, a sales type use case, oftentimes you may want to push out a summarized set of content to your sales management that summarizes the key metrics for their region, again, pre-filtered to their particular territory with any exceptional data that we might have found and any live dashboards that they may want to look at on a regular basis, again, regardless of the tools they might have come from. So, here Tableau, here Power BI, I look at those every day, make them easily available. So this concept of being able to curate the content, not just rely on users to come and search for it and find it, is critical out in the case where business users are going to spend a couple of minutes each day looking at data. And also being able to do that in a very agile fashion. So particularly with this company in the COVID era, they're learning all the time. What they're measuring the business on is oftentimes changing in a very rapid way. So if there's additional metrics that we need to bring into the mix at any point in time, I should be able to pull that from the catalog very easily, drop it on here, and be able to provide that as needed to the business.
Great, thank you. So end results of that, basically what were they able to accomplish? They were able to get to a single source of truth, all the metrics and KPIs in a single place. That generated a lot of agility, since people didn't have to search for things. They didn't have to know what, can I trust this, can I not? They knew they could trust it. They knew they were able to, they create a focused view of each particular business unit, individual's universe. That increased engagement with the data, increased agility of decision-making, and increased trust. So there are some common themes, right, that you saw in our discussion. I want to touch on those for a moment before we sort of dive into Q&A. So one common theme we've seen across these 4 use cases, but really not just here, but across all the customers that we've seen tackle this single source of truth problem, is that, quality data, you have to start with that. It's very important. But the truth is that nobody has 100% quality, accurate data 100% of the time. There are always issues that occur periodically in every organization causing some problem with the data. Something happens in the pipeline that's unexpected. Hopefully not every day, hopefully not frequently, but it does happen. And so being able to generate a high level of trust in the data means that you need to be able to know when those things happen and be proactive and communicate to those users. Let them know, hey, if this anomaly in the data, if there's something happened in the data pipelining for your Tableau data feed for a particular group, then let that group know before they've gone into Tableau and discovered that data issue, that there's a problem with the data that you're working on, that you're fixing it. And that's been what we've seen is absolutely essential to being able to create a high level of confidence and people to feel like they trust the single source of truth that they're presented with. Secondly, organizing and content so that it's discoverable is just absolutely essential. So if any organization of any size has hundreds, usually thousands or many thousands of pieces of content out there. So being able to put them together in some mechanism where they're tagged, they're searchable, they're discoverable, they're easily accessed in the same way that you can go to Google and you can find the most relevant content that you might be looking for through search there. You need to be able to enable the same kind of capability for your BI content so that people can get to the content quickly. Because if you need to go to 19 different places, or if you need to search through lots of irrelevant content before you get to the thing that's relevant, if you don't know what's certified, that just means that you're creating obstacles for your users and they will give up and they will not get to that single source of truth that you created for them. So certification, making it trustworthy is absolutely essential. We talked about earlier how the importance of not just knowing what's certified, but knowing who certified it and when. And in fact, even being able to go through a process by which you recertify things that changed, right? So all those things are very important to make sure that people know that it isn't just a fire and forget. This thing wasn't just certified and then forgotten about. This is content that is actively, that I can trust, that is actively being looked at and recertified as it needs to be recertified. And then the fourth key thing is having focus via anomaly and exception detection. So again, there's some class of information where you don't want to push out that information to users every day, or you don't want them to look at it every day because unless it changes, it's not important for them to look at. And so coming up with a delivery mechanism where you push the anomalies to them, you push the exceptions to them, that generates a much higher level of engagement, and therefore they begin to trust the data and they know that it's useful. And they work with it. And then finally, the distribution, right? So it is a mistake to think that no matter how good your analytics are, that you can just publish them out there and that your users will universally engage with them. You need to go further. You need to be able to figure out what are the must-have analytics that people should look at every day. You need to understand what slices of those analytics a particular group should work with, and then create the mechanism by which they can receive that content with really almost zero effort so that it's there for them to consume. So with that, we're gonna take a look at questions that we've had and see what we have to add with the process.
Yeah, so some questions coming in. Again, if you have questions, that's the end of the content portion. So please enter them in the Q&A window or the chat window in the Zoom. We've had some come in already. So Marius, I'll fire a few of these off to you. So what are some common steps that companies take around the usage statistics that you mentioned?
As far as the usage stats, usually there's a process by which you collect and harvest usage statistics both from the underlying BI tool, and you also look at your usage statistics within the portal itself, and then you do a grooming process. So I like to think of the fact that your content in your portal is like a garden. Right. And if you've ever tended to a garden, you know that you've got to do weeding, you've got to be able to take out the things that are in the way, and you've got to plant new things, as you need them. So it's the same principle here. So you look at it and you say, well, geez, here's the content that's not being used at all. Well, what do we do about that? Well, we either promote some of that content. Maybe you say, well, this is something they should be using. This audience is not using it. How do we, reach out to them, make sure they're aware of it, do some education. If you do that and it's still not getting consumed, then it's a question of surveys, understanding, what is missing? Is there something incorrect here? Is there something that's not what they really need to do their business? And then if it really is not a good fit, weed it out, take it out. And then similarly engaging with the user community to understand if they're not engaged, is it because the content that they need is not there? So looking at what are they searching for? Other things that they're searching for that are not found. What do they really want to find? And then making sure that you tailor that content in the portal. So it's as much about process as it is technology. Certainly need the technology to do it, but you've got to have a good, well-defined process and a regular tending of the garden to make that work.
Okay, one here. How do you go about getting buy-in from leadership to strive towards a single source of truth?
That's a great question. So, I think that usually honestly, for most leaders, if you show them your engagement statistics and your ROI information around your analytics, that speaks for itself. So most organizations saying, look, here's an opportunity. We have these many people that we could serve with analytics. Let's look at the usage stats. We're only serving a percentage of those. There's an opportunity here to really get some significant ROI out of really leveraging a wider scale adoption. That tends to be a fairly compelling argument. And then oftentimes also you can also start with the executive leadership team from the beginning, looking at their needs, looking at places where they are not really seeing the single source of truth that they need, and then building solutions out for them, targeting that in initial implementations, and then rolling out more broadly after that. So kind of starting from the top out is another way to kind of build a lot of support for this.
There's a question here. Are contributors expected to be Tableau or other platform proficient? And if not, how do you go about balancing time to train them versus other responsibilities? So contributors, I guess, is the key thing there.
I guess contributors in that sense would be the folks that are publishing content to the portal, right? Mm-hmm. And so typically the people that are publishing content to the portal it can vary. So we have some customers where the publishers are in fact the BI tool analysts, right? So they are the folks that are building those analytics. They know what, they want to be able to put something up on the content, and they put it up and up it goes. Other scenarios, organizations, that's not the case at all. And what we have is a set of folks that do that curation, that validation. And in that situation, content publishers are maybe creating that content, maybe in Tableau and Power BI and MicroStrategy, whatever tools they're using. They're putting them in specific folders. That content is automatically synced into someplace in the folder, in the portal, but not necessarily into a visible area for the end users. And then maybe the business leadership or the content curators, if you like, are simply going through that content and identifying what they can certify and what can get moved over from the general area into the area where the end users are going to consume it. And in that scenario, then those users do not need to be proficient in Tableau. They just need to be able to build it, certainly not in building content with Tableau. They just need to be able to look at the visualization, look at and see, does it understand enough about the data to understand, does it really provide what we need, provide the right level of tagging and documentation, and then move it to the right place. So it really depends on your organization and what you're trying to accomplish. Both models can work.
Question here. So what is the best way to come up with a single source of truth when companies switches between multiple source systems?
Oh, yeah, that's a great, so basically you have a scenario where let's say you're using Salesforce for a while, and you're using, then all of a sudden you switch to some Salesforce competitor or something like that for that particular source. And that is in fact a challenge, and that kind of change happens all the time. I would say that the best way to do that is to try to abstract that from your users. So Mike showed at the beginning kind of the notion of the fact that you could have metrics, you could have data, and it could be, it's just a tile. Right? So we've often seen scenarios where users will migrate from one BI tool to another, or from one source to another. And the way that they accomplish transparency there is they make it so that the user don't need to even know about that really, right? So there's a tile, imagine a tile that has a KPI. That KPI is sourced from one place. Once the BI team has determined that there's a new source, we validated it, then that KPI source is moved to the new location, but the history is maintained from the old source so that everything it continues in a very coherent way. So that's sort of one strategy to make it transparent. Similarly with a report, you might keep that same tile, replace underneath where it points. So maybe initially you were pointing to one BI tool, and now you move to another BI tool and you replace that visualization, swap it out underneath, make sure there's the documentation that goes with that so users are immediately notified about that change, but make it really easy for users not to have to navigate a maze of figuring out where things are sourced from.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I think it's about communication as much as anything, right?
Yeah.
And making sure people understand what they're looking at, and again, they're not typically worried about what the technology is behind the scenes.
No, users don't care.
I think there's a question here that is somewhat related, or a couple of questions that are somewhat related to that, but more at the data level. So how do you achieve a single source of truth if there's sort of decentralized data processing going on, in these different groups around the organization, different frequency of data for effectively the same thing?
Yeah, and that's a really good question as well, and that's a big challenge. And I think that goes back to the idea of decentralization, but decentralization with governance. So the mistake that we see people do is they either go to one model or the other. It's either completely decentralized and they say, oh, every business unit is responsible for managing what they're doing, and so go do it. And you're accountable to your business groups. That means there's no consistency, there's no governance at a high level, everyone's doing something different. Or they go completely centralized, but that completely centralized model breaks down at scale, right? You just can't do it in a large enterprise. There's no one team that's gonna be able to do all that. So the key is to have both, right? To have a centralized center of excellence that establishes baseline governance standards, right? So what is the data pipeline quality checks that need to be in place? How do you know what kind of mechanisms you need to have in place to make sure that that's correct? What kind of validation as a standard you as an organization need to have in place? You need to have a data steward that's in each organization that's going to stakeholder, and then getting buy-in for those particular roles to be supported, and then rolling that out broadly. And that way, each particular distributed organization is responsible, of course, for figuring out what are the right analytics, how often do we collect them, what's the right documentation put in here. But before something can be certified, it must meet the following criteria that has been agreed upon and sort of is set up as a standard at the CIO level, right? And so that work, while it takes a little bit of work to do, it's not a trivial thing to do, and it's a process thing that has to be identified. Once you create that and you roll it out, it can have a dramatic impact because everybody is able to have the freedom to do what they need, but they have to hold to the standards that have been created centrally.
All right, Marius, I think we have time for, I think we are on the last question here. You've got sort of 1 minute on it. Where are we? We've lost trust with some of our business units. How do you go about regaining trust?
Yeah, that's quite a challenge as well, right? It's much easier to keep trust than it is to lose trust. But a lot of times you have enough data issues or problems with inconsistent reporting, then trust goes down. I think it's not an uncommon question. And I think you have to just rebuild trust slowly, incrementally. And I think I would suggest starting with a notion of certification. So you cannot boil the ocean in a situation. If you've got 1,000 reports out there, you just can't go out there and make sure everything is consistent across 1,000 or 10,000 or however many things you have, right? But what you can do is you can start looking at your engagement. You can start looking at what content is being used most commonly. And then you can start with that content and those areas and start certifying, figure out a standard for certification, putting things through that flow, and then communicating in a very transparent way to the business and say, here's what we're doing. We recognize there's an issue. And to address that issue, we're going to start going through our content. We're going to start certifying it. Here's what it means. Here's what the accountability layer is going to be around that. Here's who you can hold accountable to that. Here's the process that's going to be followed. And then by executing that process, you can incrementally, one step at a time, build a much higher level of trust within the organization over time.
I think that's got us through the questions, and we're pretty much at the top of the hour here. So thank you everyone for joining us today. As we mentioned at the beginning, the recording is available. I'll hand it over to Charlene to close things down here.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Marius. As Mike mentioned, this has been recorded. We'll also send the recording out and the static slides for everyone who attended today's webinar. And that's all we have for you today. We thank you again for spending some of your time with us, and thank you for joining today's webinar.